Imagine this. You wake up on September 12, 2001 and pick up your morning newspaper. The events of the previous day are impossible to escape. Not just on the front page, but through all the sections. Local news, business, entertainment, sports. But there was an exception, one respite from tragedy. The comics page remained in the pre-9/11 bubble. Heathcliff's gag was about campaign finance reform, while Ziggy was riffing on reality TV. Because of the way the comics were written at least a few weeks in advance, the funny pages were always lagging a bit behind the rest of the world. But cartoonists were now faced with an immediate challenge. How would they handle the attacks in their comic strips? Some responded by dropping storylines. A plan to have Dilbert start an airline was scrapped. In Dick Tracy, a group of villains were downgraded from eco-terrorists to mere eco-vandals. Doonesbury pulled a week of strips that were mocking President George W. Bush and replaced them with rerun material. Cartoonist Gary Trudeau said in a statement that the strips would have been clearly unsuitable for publication during a time of national crisis. Some of the first references came 2 weeks later, with the Boondocks and Foxtrot both showing their characters dealing with the attacks. I ultimately made the decision to deal with it, because I feel like that's why I got into cartooning in the first place, to address these issues, Boondocks creator Aaron Magruder said. I've made a point to establish that this cartoon family lives in the same world we all do, Foxtrot creator Bill Allman said. It's exaggerated, but it has the same movies and video games and buggy computer operating systems. This attack was too big an event to avoid if I wanted to maintain my fictional family's credibility as a mirror of our own. Plus, there was a simple reality that was all I could think about. More strips would follow on October 1st. These strips are an interesting time capsule, because they were drawn in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. This is a reflex act, a way of venting our emotions, non-sequitur cartoonist Wally Miller said. Cartoonists were still processing what had happened, but they had to think ahead a few weeks. Their characters wouldn't be reacting in shock. They would have had time for a new reality to sink in. Some strips show obvious signs of when they were written, like Get Fuzzy. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there was a surge in people donating blood, anticipating that hospitals would be overwhelmed by huge numbers of victims. Get Fuzzy followed its blood donation story by having main character Rob attend a memorial service with his firefighter father. Funky Winkerbean began the week of October 1st by having one of its longtime characters on TV reporting from New York. Funky creator Tom Baddock said he felt compelled to address 9/11. The comics that don't touch on it, there's a disconnect, he said. It's kind of jarring. Adam made only an indirect but unmistakable nod towards the events of 9/11. Doonesbury approached things on an existential level, with actress character Boopsie finding she could no longer care about the things that she used to. More strips would follow the next week. In Luann, the parents worried for the future of their children. Mallard Fillmore was reading about 9/11 in the paper. Hagar the Horrible reflected on the loss of a tree. Some cartoonists chose not to acknowledge the attacks, but instead focused on providing a diversion. I think some people have a responsibility to restore normal spirits, Dilbert creator Scott Adams said. I feel I'm more in that crowd. Should a comic strip reflect reality or be a break from it? This is a question cartoonists have been dealing with for a long time. During the Second World War, a lot of cartoonists had their characters join the war effort. But Al Capp chose not to have his famous character Lil Abner enlist. He explained this decision in a note to readers. Perhaps Lil Abner and his friends, living through these terrible days in a peaceful, happy, free world, will do their part, by thus reminding us that this is what we are fighting for, to have that world again, he wrote. There are a lot of comic strips that never acknowledge 9/11. But I'm going to look at 3 that didn't just mention it, but made it the central focus. Doonesbury, the Boondocks, and Mallard Fillmore. Each brought its own political lens to the comics page. Doonesbury was an institution, the embodiment of a certain strain of baby boomer liberalism. The Boondocks was also approaching things from the left, but with more of a radical edge. And then there was Mallard Fillmore, a comic about a conservative duck that was aptly described as the Fox News of the comics page. In 2001, Doonesbury had been running for 30 years. It started as a strip about college students, but since the early 1980s, its characters had been aging more or less in real time. Cartoonist Gary Trudeau had never been afraid of tackling heavy subjects in this strip. Everything from the Vietnam War to the AIDS crisis. He took the same approach to 9/11. After spending a week with Boopsie and her football coach husband BD, the strip switches to title character Mike Doonesbury. There are dozens of characters in Doonesbury, each with their own elaborate history. As it happened, Mike had got a job at the World Trade Center in 1984, working at an ad agency. Trudeau used this to create a storyline where Mike is traveling back to New York City to attend the funeral of a former boss. On his flight, he sits next to a Muslim Palm Pilot salesman, which gave Trudeau a chance to explore how even a liberal character like Mike has biases. The danger of doing a political comic strip is ending up with one-dimensional characters who are either strawmen or mouthpieces for the cartoonist's own opinions. Doonesbury has always been a strip more interested in moral complexity. You can see this in the funeral of Mike's old boss, who's revealed to be both a hero who helped others escape and a bad boss who sexually harassed his employees. A lot of people don't like Doonesbury. It's been dropped by papers or moved to the editorial page due to reader complaints. But I think the months after 9/11 show the strip at its best. Trudeau juggled the storylines of multiple characters as their lives were changed by the attacks. BD, a veteran, is called up to provide security at Ground Zero. Roland Headley, a character first seen reporting on the Vietnam War, is dispatched to Afghanistan. Jeff, one of the strip's younger characters, applies to join the CIA. Abu, the Palm Pilot salesman, is questioned by the FBI. Later, he rejoins Mike on his flight back from New York, and things come full circle. While Trudeau held off from criticizing the president in the wake of the attacks, Boondocks creator Aaron Magruder wasn't pulling any punches. On October 3rd, main character Huey Freeman calls an FBI tip line, where he reports Ronald Reagan for arming and training Osama bin Laden. He then reports George W. Bush for sending millions to the Taliban. These strips generated a lot of angry letters, and led to the Boondocks being dropped by some papers. At 27, Magruder was one of the youngest cartoonists on the comics page. The Boondocks was still a pretty new strip, but it had already managed to get into a lot of papers. Magruder wasn't afraid to risk that by speaking out against what he saw as warmongering. "I think if there's an incident that's worth ruining your career over, this is it," he said. "I'm always afraid I'll regret not having said something, small as my voice may be." Huey echoed a similar sentiment in the comic as he continued to criticize Bush in his underground newspaper. At the same time, Huey admitted he was shaken by the attacks, just like everybody else. Anticipating the backlash, Magruder created an ultra-patriotic parody strip called The Adventures of Flaggy and Ribbon and pretended to have it replace the Boondocks. Next week, Huey was back, pointing out how oil companies would profit from the war on terror and calling Dick Cheney evil. October ends with Huey being terrified by the popularity of the president. Mallard Fillmore took a bit longer to address 9/11. On October 1st, it began a week of strips attacking Social Security, which seems very on brand. On October 8th, it acknowledged the attacks for the first time. At first, Mallard Fillmore cartoonist Bruce Tinsley tried to take an uplifting approach, celebrating the resiliency of America and New Yorkers. "I have an inherent aversion to doing things that seem sappy," said Tinsley, "but against the backdrop of what's happened, for one of the rare times in my career, I don't think I could be too positive." It took less than a week, though, for Mallard Fillmore to start using 9/11 as a way to attack familiar targets, like the media, college professors, and the very concept of progress. Starting on October 15th, Mallard did a whole week of strips complaining about requests for tolerance. Mallard is quick to let us know that he personally has nothing against Muslims, but being asked to tolerate them gets his feathers in a ruffle. The next week, the strip resumes its one-sided rivalry with Doonesbury. Gary Trudeau, depicted as a Twinkie, is grilled by Mallard, with the duck defending the intelligence of President George W. Bush. Then Mallard pulls a fake out. You think he's in Afghanistan, but he's actually reporting from UC Berkeley. The next 2 weeks are spent on familiar ground, attacking universities as being anti-American. Mallard Fillmore seems like it didn't really have that much to say about 9/11, besides complaining about calls for tolerance and anything that it perceived as moral relativism. Also, Mallard thought it was a great idea for airline pilots to have guns. To me, the funniest thing about Mallard Fillmore is how petty it can be. There's a long history of cartoonists using their strips to complain about things that irk them, but Tinsley took this to a different level. After being convicted for driving under the influence in 2006, he used his strip to attack the judge who had sentenced him. Tinsley shows the same pettiness with a series of strips complaining about news anchor Peter Jennings smirking too much. This is kind of a weird fixation for Mallard Fillmore, one that we'll return to for years to come. Mallard Fillmore goes back to uplifting mode for Thanksgiving, but then follows that with a joke about Rodney King. Thanksgiving was a day when a lot of strips chose to address 9/11. There was an organized campaign started by Mutt's creator Patrick McDonnell for cartoonists to use their strips to raise money for charity. Over 100 cartoonists opted to take part. Their strips touch on some common themes. Many paid tribute to firefighters or police officers, Mother Goose and Grimm, Mutts, High and Lois, Blondie, Pluggers. Even Heathcliff wants to meet a firefighter. Other strips show their characters reflecting as they gather for Thanksgiving dinner. Nancy, Crankshaft, Mama, the buckets. The American flag is on display in the family circus, Dennis the Menace, and Kathy. Even Croc, a strip set during France's colonial past, is flying the stars and stripes. Snuffy Smith, a notorious cheapskate, donates money to help the victims of 9/11. Monty, the strip formerly known as Robot Man, goes with a minimalist approach. To me, the most interesting of these strips is Beetle Bailey. Now you might look at this strip, which features Beetle and Sarge riding on a giant eagle, and think that it's pretty cheesy or over the top. And I guess it sort of is. But I also think there's a real sincerity to it. And it has more meaning when you understand the context it was drawn in. In 2001, Beetle Bailey cartoonist Mort Walker was 78 years old. He'd been drawing a strip for half a century. Early on the morning of September 11th, he flew from his home in Connecticut to Florida. He looked out the window of the plane and saw the World Trade Center, just hours before it would be destroyed. It was beautiful, he later told a reporter. It was bathed in the golden dawn. By the time his plane landed, the world had changed. The towers had been struck along with the Pentagon. United Flight 93 had crashed. I cried for 3 days, Walker said. It's one of those things you can never forget. It was like Hiroshima. How did it happen? Walker was a veteran of the Second World War, an officer in the U.S. Army. He knew all too well the horrors that people could inflict on each other. I think it's sort of interesting that he chose to compare 9/11 not to Pearl Harbor, but to the bombing of Hiroshima. It's also interesting that Beetle Bailey, a strip about the military, shows his title character holding an American flag as he flies towards a cloud-labeled piece. Beetle Bailey in recent decades can feel a bit toothless. Its depiction of the military can seem a bit abstract and stuck in the Korean War period. But in the early years of the strip, Walker drew on his own experience to take some jabs at the military establishment. The strip was actually temporarily banned from the Pacific edition of the Stars and Stripes, a newspaper for America's armed forces. After 9/11, Walker dropped any criticism of the Pentagon. We've had to clean up our act, he said. After Thanksgiving, comic strips mostly returned to their normal routines. There were some changes. Luann's older brother Brad was inspired to become a firefighter. And of course, Doonesbury, Mallard Fillmore, and the Boondocks would all keep addressing current events. Throughout 2002, Doonesbury was largely focused on other issues, like Enron. But it did address the Whitehouse's efforts to avoid blame for intelligence failures leading up to 9/11 and its push to invade Iraq. A character leaks a CIA plan for regime change in Iraq to his father, a reporter. One prescient strip even offered a preview of panels from 2003, showing the war in Iraq already underway. For purposes of research, I read through, or at least skimmed, every Mallard Fillmore strip from 2002. This isn't something I'd recommend doing, but it was interesting. Mallard throws a bit of shade at America's allies for not being sufficiently supportive of the war on terror, but his big theme for 2002 is profiling. It's difficult to overstate how much this cartoon duck loves profiling. In Mallard's view, the FBI and the TSA were going too easy on Muslims, or people who looked like they might be Muslim. Mallard was still up in arms over any attempts to encourage tolerance. He also used the 9/11 attacks as a way to go after some familiar targets, like college professors and teachers' unions. The Boondocks were still not pulling any punches, like with this strip about Henry Kissinger. Despite complaints from readers, the Boondocks didn't live up in its criticism of the president. Flaggy and Ribbon are shown forgotten in the basement, but they make a triumphant return in the fall as the push towards war with Iraq intensifies. The first anniversary of September 11th presented another opportunity for cartoonists to address the attacks. Dennis the Menace and the Family Circus show a character tearfully remembering 9/11. Marvin attempts to incorporate a reference to the Twin Towers into the world of its toddler character. A well-intentioned effort, I'm sure, but maybe not the approach I would have taken. Spider-Man presents what I think is a more tasteful tribute to the Twin Towers. One Big Happy remembers some of the victims of the attacks. I like the simple directness of this Pearls Before Swine strip. Not every strip on that day was about 9/11, of course. For some, it's just a slice of normal life in 2002. The Lockhorns are returning a video they rented. Heathcliff, at the beginning of its weird era, does a joke that I think is referencing Vanessa Williams losing her title as Miss America over nude photos. Notably, that happened in 1984, so this is not exactly a topical joke. Beetle Bailey offers a strip that can only be described as very 2002. Or more specifically, how 2002 must have seemed to someone who was born in 1923. I could make a whole separate video about how the comics page dealt with the War on Terror. Instead, I'll just briefly focus on a few things that I thought were interesting. Dick Tracy, which had dropped an eco-terrorist storyline back in 2001, eventually introduced a terrorist character named Al Qaeda. Doonesbury has a tradition of depicting the presidents as icons. Bill Clinton was a waffle, for example. George W. Bush was originally an asterisk in a cowboy hat. I dig at how he won the 2000 election. After the invasion of Iraq, Trudeau replaced the cowboy hat with a Roman legionnaires helmet, which became more tattered as the war went on. The war in Iraq gave Doonesbury one of its most celebrated narrative arcs, where soldier character BD loses his leg after his Humvee is struck by a rocket-propelled grenade. The full run of these strips was collected in a book, proceeds from which went to a charity that supports the families of wounded soldiers. Republican Senator John McCain, who had once denounced Doonesbury on the floor of the Senate, wrote an introduction for the book. Biting but never cynical and often wickedly funny, these comic strips will make you laugh, reflect, and in the end, understand, McCain wrote. Mallard Fillmore didn't spend as much time addressing the war as Doonesbury. But one thing I find fascinating is how the strip dealt with Abu Ghraib, a prison where it was revealed that the US military and the CIA had been torturing Iraqi detainees. In one strip, Mallard identifies as a moral absolutist who thinks in terms of good and evil, and someone who believes America is better than all other countries. This framework might have worked in response to the 9/11 attacks, but it struggles to handle something like Abu Ghraib. Over the course of a month, Tinsley spends a dozen strips on the scandal without saying much of any substance. Mallard can't really defend Abu Ghraib, so instead he attacks the media for covering it and Democrats for comparing it to torture committed by Saddam Hussein. Mallard's position basically boils down to, yes, this is bad, but what about atrocities committed by Islamic militants? Yes, this is bad, but really isn't abuse a more accurate description than torture? The Boondocks, on the other hand, just needed one strip to make its point. For the 10th anniversary of 9/11, the comics page took another moment to reflect. This time September 11th fell on a Sunday, giving the cartoonists a larger canvas to work with. I thought one of the most interesting examples was Buckles, which incorporated the actual strip that had run on September 11th, 2001. Zitz shows a teen being embraced by his parents. Marvin does another building blocks as Twin Towers bit, as does Baby Blues. Dennis the Menace is annoying his neighbor, but in a patriotic way. In The Family Circus, Jeffy prays for the world. Mother Goose and Graham does another firefighter strip. In Curtis, the dad explains the events of 9/11. In Over the Hedge, butterflies form two towers in the air. Mutz has a dog telling his master to heel. High and Lows expands on its strip from a decade prior. Even strips that take place in the past get in on the act. The Wizard of Id features something called Patriot Day. Hagar the Horrible pays tribute to heroes. And then there's Snuffy Smith. I guess this is not a great thing to admit, but this may actually be the closest I've ever come to laughing at a Snuffy Smith strip. Seeing Snuffy discussing such a serious topic was so jarring that it sort of caught me off guard. On the other hand, I found Beetle Bailey's contribution to be kind of touching. I feel like some of these strips are kind of obvious. Like Blondie, for example, is a perfectly fine tribute, but also feels like the kind of thing that an AI could come up with. Have all your characters standing around outside, saluting a flag, while a policeman and a firefighter look on. But there's something kind of odd and human about this Beetle Bailey strip. You have a cartoonist who has spent 60 years drawing some of these characters, and he's just showing them all crying. At this point, Mort Walker was 88 years old. He was beyond caring about whether people might think his work was maybe a bit cheesy. Pretty soon we'll be coming up on the 25th anniversary of 9/11. I'm sure there'll be some comic strips planning some sort of tribute, but I don't think we'll see anything like what we saw a quarter of a century ago, when 100 different cartoonists each offered up their own take on a national tragedy. Today, quite a few strips have gone into reruns, with some only having new material on Sundays, including Doonesbury. I think the comics page has also become more risk-averse. America's remaining newspapers have largely been consolidated into chains. In the past, when a strip got dropped, that was a decision made by an editor at an individual paper, based on feedback from readers. Now the decision about what goes on the comics page has been centralized. Dozens of papers owned by the same company share the same comics page. Mallard Fillmore ran afoul of this in 2021, when the Gannett chain dropped it from 50 papers at once. Bruce Tinsley has since handed off the strip to a new cartoonist. Mallard Fillmore has been toned down a bit, but the Duck is still doing his thing. America's various wars haven't made him any less of a hawk, with Mallard now supporting the idea of invading Cuba. The Boondocks is long gone from the comics page. 7 years after making a big debut in hundreds of papers, the strip quietly ended in 2006, when Aaron Magruder took a break and never returned. At the time, Magruder was working on launching an animated series based on his strip. It's kind of ironic that Huey and Riley Freeman are probably the most recognizable comic strip characters to debut in the 1990s, but today a lot of people probably don't realize that they ever appeared in newspapers. It's hard to imagine a strip like the Boondocks appearing on the comics page today. Really, it's hard to believe it ever managed to get into so many newspapers. Just look at this strip from May of 2002. At this point, the Boondocks had already angered a lot of readers with its criticism of the president and his war on terror. But Magruder points out that he's only able to say these things because they're considered acceptable dissent, and the companies that distribute and print his comic strip have deemed them not to be a threat to the power structure of America. It's kind of crazy that this was printed in the same comic section as Garfield. There's a lot of parallels between the careers of Aaron Magruder and Gary Trudeau. Both started out drawing strips for their college papers and then made the leap to syndication. Both saw their work appear in the opinion section instead of on the comics page, but I think you see a key difference around September 11th. While Trudeau temporarily held back from criticizing the president, Magruder doubled down. Reading the Boondocks from around that time, it's pretty clear that this was never going to be the strip that ran for decades like Doonesbury. I can't see a U.S. senator writing a foreword for a collection of Boondocks strips. The Boondocks was always destined for a short, intense run. Mallard Fillmore, though, found a more sustainable formula. Bruce Tinsley started out as a journalist, and he recognized that he could take advantage of newspapers wanting to be seen as fair and balanced. If a paper was running a left-leaning strip like Doonesbury, it could add in Mallard Fillmore as a right-leaning counterweight. But I think the basic selling point of Mallard Fillmore, that it exists to bring a conservative voice to the otherwise liberal comics page, is flawed. Penn State professor Matt McAllister pointed this out in an article about Mallard Fillmore. Strips like Family Circus and Blondie all have a normative view of the family and how people should behave, he said. I think it's naive to think that politics and ideology don't get filtered into the comics, and most of that is conservative. After September 11th, you could see some of that innate conservatism on the comics page. Characters rallying around the flag, a reluctance to question authority. But then at the same time, you had a strip like this. And that's part of what I love about the comics page. I'm sure the comic strip as an art form will outlive the newspaper, but there's something special about having a bunch of very different strips collected together in one place every day. I imagine in the future that historians trying to understand 9/11 will find newspapers to be an invaluable resource. The news stories, the editorials, the letters to the editor. But I think they'll also be able to learn a lot from the comics page. Cartoonists captured the complexity of that moment, a time of fear and resilience, of division and coming together, of rallying around the flag and questioning those in charge. A time even, amid a drive to war, of hoping for a peaceful future.